Yes, indeed, I do have battle scars from a number of wars when I was developing or revising those standards in Massachusetts over a decade ago. The math wars, the history wars, the reading wars, the science wars, whatever was going on, I was in the middle of the war. And there were lots of darts and arrows going all ways, but as I've always told people, the stars were aligned in my heaven. I had a commissioner who supported me, a board of education that supported me, and a governor, series of governors that supported me. So I was able, with the help of a very good staff at the Department of Education in Massachusetts, to get through what turned out to be considered the best sets of academic standards K-12 in the country, and Massachusetts teachers followed through because they are the ones I would really give the credit to. If education, teaching and learning takes place anywhere, it doesn't take place in words on paper, it takes place in a classroom with what teachers do. And if teachers can follow and use well a set of words that they can read clearly, you're getting hints of what I'm going to be saying later on, then they will teach to what they are inspired to teach. And they all did me proud, and why they now don't have those standards in English and math to use is a function of money. $250 million worth of race to the top money that was promised to the state in 2010 if it dumped its good standards and adopted Common Core. And that's how we lost at least those two sets of standards. And people do need to know that, because I'm usually asked if they were so wonderful, what happened to them? Well, money talks, and Governor Patrick was a friend of President Obama, and $250 million was an awful lot of money not to want to somehow have come to the Department of Ed, which it did. What was bizarre to begin with was the fact that this was a committee chosen by the very two organizations that developed the standards. Now, you can use common sense to figure out that if you want to ensure that you have got first-class standards, you have independent experts evaluate those standards. You don't appoint your own experts to tell you that you have created first-class standards. So here is a committee of about 29 people altogether, ultimately, who were appointed by the same two groups that together developed the Common Core standards with the help of the Gates Foundation money. And the Gates Foundation, of course, is looming in the background with anything that has to do with Common Core. I think he has managed to buy our entire public education system at a very cheap price. It's actually not just a couple of $150, $200 million is a lot more than that when you start totaling up even the grants that he's now giving to departments of education to sell Common Core to the parents, because he couldn't figure out how to buy off the parents. That was one of the groups that was not represented on any of the committees. First of all, we start with the Standards Development Committee. We don't know to this day why the people who were on it were chosen, because, as I mentioned, there was a totally non-transparent process. Two organizations, National Governors Association, CCSSO, Council of Chief State School Officers, these are superintendents or commissioners of education across the country, whose dues are paid for by taxpayer money, and those two organizations were given money by the Gates Foundation to develop the standards and to choose the people who would be on the committee developing them. And most of the people on that original committee to develop the college readiness standards, as they were called, that's very significant, were connected to the testing industry. First time in our history we've had people mainly connected to the testing industry to develop our standards. Not discipline-based organizations, not people in education schools, but people connected to the testing industry. There were no high school teachers of math, no high school teachers of English. Those were the two sets of standards being developed. There was not one literary scholar, there was one mathematician. All the rest were connected to the testing industry. Then when we get to the standards writing committee, who was actually chosen to write the standards, in English, the two people's names are very well known, David Coleman and Sue Pimentel. David Coleman is now president of the college boards. He's gone on, in my view, to do the same wrecking job there that he did on the K-12 standards for English language arts. But both of them were people who had never taught in K-12, had never taught in higher education, had never written a thing about education that had ever been published in an education journal, had no involvement with K-12, and nobody in the field even knew them. They were totally unknown. Now, the two people who wrote the math standards, they had PhDs in mathematics, so one could not say they didn't have the content knowledge, but they too had not taught in K-12, they had no connection with the field of education. The question that might have been asked, that should have been asked, was who chose them? Why were they chosen? To this day, no one knows. You can't FOIA any records from two private organizations because I have suggested that to reporters who've tried, and you can't FOIA anything from private organizations. So nothing is transparent. Whatever decisions were made by these two organizations to develop what were to be national standards, to this day we don't know and we'll never find out. But here was a committee that could not validate these standards. So you have, right now, 45 boards of education in the states of this country who have adopted a set of standards that were put together by unknown people, unknown to the field to this day, who really didn't know what they were doing, and that's putting it charitably, and who have come out with various diktats about pedagogy, about which they know nothing. And schools and teachers are following these guidelines as if they were given to them by some sort of commandment process, when the people who developed these standards had no idea what they were talking about for the most part. So you have to, I mean, it's a commentary on something going on in this country, that you would have boards of education that never asked their own higher ed faculty to look at these college readiness standards, and teachers and superintendents in the field to this day who don't dare question some of the bizarre practices that are built into these particular standards.